Hello and welcome to this game review. So in this game, Black got some initiative out of the opening, which they did not manage to use properly. And later we got a rook endgame, which was drawn, but of course it's never easy with rook endgames, so we'll try to understand what went wrong. So it started as the some London system, and both players played symmetrically. Black played more actively with c5. Here, of course, c5 is a desirable move, but it's not really accurate because white has this small tactic, which is quite a weird one, which is to take on b8, with the point that if the rook takes back, now, well, firstly there's this pawn, but more importantly there's this check, after which black cannot block because of knight e5. So black will have to go king e7, when this is quite unpleasant. The engine suggests here to play g5, which is very funny, but this is how chess is usually played with the computers. Otherwise, the queen can take on b8 as well, but this is quite similar. Here the king can go to d8, and this is not as bad. And black does have the bishop pair. But okay, knight bd2, knight c6, both sides developed. And h3 is a bit slow, and black starts to take the initiative with c4. Now the queen has to go back to d1 eventually, but here queen a4. Black played a6, which is fine, but even better would have been to avoid counterplay on the king side with either h6 or h5, with the idea to preserve this bishop, which is on f5, to avoid g4 and to avoid knight h4, to have a square for the bishop on h7. For example, after this, black's next moves will be a6 and b5, and it's not clear what white is supposed to do. If b3, black has this nice move, bishop c2, with the point that after this, there's a6 to trap the queen, with b5 next move. So of course this isn't obvious, but these are some interesting London tactics. Okay, a6. Now, black does take space on the queen side, but his bishop pair is in danger. And here we have this typical question of what to do with this threat. So firstly, if black just develops, then this is kind of annoying, because white can continue with g4, opening up the light squares, especially while black is undeveloped, and we will have probably some long-term weaknesses, and also the bishop will be quite annoying on h3 or on g2 as well. But the usual recipe is to go to here, and now if white takes, we will at least open up our rook, and the d5 pawn will remain strong. Otherwise, bishop e4 is also an interesting way to play, with the point that if white takes here, now we have a strong knight. We're also threatening g5, and our structure has not been changed. Of course, white does have the bishop pair, but we have easy play on the queen side with b4 eventually. But knight e7 is a bit awkward, because now our bishop is closed, at least for the moment, and even after the knight goes to f5, which was the plan, the knight doesn't really look very good here, and it can even be attacked with g4. Okay, queen c2. Now black continues development. Generally, if our opponent has the bishop pair, we should try to exchange it if possible. And here, for example, black would be a bit better, because he has queenside space. e4 is not possible yet, and black has b4 coming very soon. Okay, bishop e7. Now we will skip a few moves, and here white is playing very strangely, queen c1, and the opening principles suggest that if our opponent is not developing pieces, not castling, and not taking the center, we should look for some initiative. And here black could have tried to play more actively with knight h4, simply attacking this. The point being that if white castles, then after f5, this knight is almost trapped. It has to go to g3, but now f4, and next move f3. At this point, black is actually just winning. It should be clear white, this king is terribly weak. White can of course try to sacrifice or something, but we can even ignore it at some point. So white should instead play g3, but now again we do not go back, we play f5, and white is actually in some trouble with his weakened king. Instead queen c7 was played, bishop g4, and here again, now that the bishop is on g4, this looks even more attractive. Knight h4. Now white can't really castle at all because after knight f5, white is just losing a piece, so he has to play g3. We can play f5, and with gh we can take the bishop, and now the position has opened up. Our pieces are very actively placed. Our rooks have the f file, we have the f4 square, and we will soon invade on the f file, and the white should be in very big trouble. Instead, black plays a bit more passively with knight d6, and unfortunately now the initiative is over. So we got some more standard position, and here white decides to take on d5, which doesn't make a lot of sense at all, since white's only trump was the bishop pair, and now had black just taken with the pawn, black would be clearly a little bit better because they have the space on the queen side, the pawns are in light squares, which complement the bishop, and black can fight for the center and the b4 break. But okay, this is fine as well. But now the position should end in a draw generally. At this point, black could have definitely played for a win without any risk by taking on d1, with the point that after all the exchanges, rook e2 will happen. And if white plays rook b1, I would think this position should be kind of winning in practice for black. For example, after rook c2, white has no play at all. The king will enter to e4 maybe, or to c5 with the b4 break, a5, b4, and I think white's defense will be extremely difficult here. Of course, the engine will hold, but in human play, it's a lot more difficult. Instead, queen e8, again, kind of a passive retreat, and here white kind of weakens his squares on the queen side, and after a4, again, white is not really developing his pieces. Black could have basically won the game with the move queen f6 instead of queen b6, attacking the pawn on f2 this way, because this also stops the opponent's queen from entering the game, not only because the square is defended, but also because c3 is attacked. And here f2 is very weak, and if white tries to defend like this, we can just take on c3 due to the hanging rook. This is winning. Otherwise, f4, this doesn't really require deep analysis, just look at this king, and after, for example, queen e6 or any other move, black will be the one with the initiative. There are several weaknesses on the board, and black should be a lot better. Instead, after queen b6, now the queen can come out, and now black is not really better. The white pieces are now attacking our king, and the best we can do is to win a pawn. Here king f8 was played, but this is already dangerous. Queen f5. A few moves later, we get this rook endgame, which should be drawn. But of course, this is a very theoretical rook endgame, and some important principles are that we should put the rook behind our opponent's passed pawn, and also we should try to get kingside counterplay while white tries to improve their king. So first the king was improved, and the rook was forced to b5, which is not the ideal square. Generally, we could have gotten a better version by putting our rook behind the pawn like this, because this is white's worst placed rook out of the possible variations where the rook can stand, and this should be an easier draw, so to say, because the rook is very passive on a5. But instead the rook was allowed to stay on the b5, on the 4th rank, defending from the side, and this is considered a little bit better than having the rook in front of our pawn. So black tries to improve their king. Generally, we should try to improve our kingside structure first, because white will try to take space here. So maybe we should play g6, h5. This would be the generally preferred way to play, to not allow g4. And now we can go with the king. But king e7, king d6, king c6. But now we have allowed white to play h5. Probably this is not the most accurate way to play, but the problem is the structure has a lot of holes and the g6 square is weak. so we will have a tough defense. From here, no, actually, if we look at the position, it's not very easy for white to make progress. For example, after check, king g2, and just moving around the rook on the a file. If king h3, we can go rook a4. And the point is, whenever white plays g4, now the king's access to g6 is cut off, and from here it's very hard to make progress for white, as they will always have to look at their kingside pawns, and simply, even theoretically, this king simply does not have a way through the queen side or the king side. But instead, king b7 is played, and here white would have won with the very nice and instructive move rook c5. The point of this move is to cut off the king forever. Of course, the pawn endgames are always lost because the king is very close. Otherwise, black can't really do anything here. They can move around the rook, but the king will eventually go to f3 or h3, and with f4 the king can go to g4, after which to f5 and to g6, and to pick up all of these weak pawns. So what happens is king g2 and king a6. Again, this allows rook c5. After g4, white is also winning, but here black decides to go for the pawn endgame, but we should be able to easily calculate that the pawn endgame is hopeless. Instead, after king b7, for example, white again has to find rook c5 at some point, because if he continues to just push on the queen side, again we will put the king on c6, and it's not clear how to make progress. For example, after g5, we can exchange, and the more pawns get exchanged, the closer we are to a draw. This position should be a draw with best play. So we should have asked white to find this rook c5 move. But this is kind of easy, this king is just not in time. We're actually 2 moves too late, and white is winning. So quite an instructive rook endgame here. And the opening also would have been better to be played more actively, but unfortunately it is how it is. But hopefully you learned something, and see you next time.